I had never been one for dramatic moments, but when they called me in for the emergency consultation, something about it felt wrong. It was the kind of urgency doctors use when they're afraid of something, and their fear seeps through even in the most clinical of settings. The clinic where they told me to come was sterile, unnervingly quiet, with pale white walls that seemed to swallow every sound. And when I saw her, Hannah, my wife, there, sitting in that sterile chair, my world stopped. I wasn't prepared. Not for the sight of her, nor for what she would say. "Hannah," I said, my voice breaking as I approached her. She didn't look at me at first. She sat there, still, a vacant look in her eyes. Something about her seemed distant. And when she finally turned to face me, I could hardly recognize her. This wasn't the woman I'd spent the last decade of my life with. No, this was someone unfamiliar, someone I didn't know. Her face, though it was hers, looked so distant, as though she didn't recognize herself. "Do you remember me?" I whispered, the words hanging in the air. Hannah blinked, her eyes wide with confusion. And then she spoke. "No," she said, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to piece together fragments of her own mind. I don't know you." It hit me like a wave of ice. The woman I loved, the woman I had built my life around, didn't know me. She didn't know me at all. My heart dropped. But before I could respond, she suddenly gasped, her expression contorting into something I couldn't place, a mixture of panic and terror. She stood up, her hands raised as though to shield herself from me. Her voice cracked when she screamed, "He's not my husband. He was dead." I froze. My body went rigid, the words echoing in my ears. "Dead?" I muttered. She backed away, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. I could barely process the scene unfolding before me. She wasn't just confused, she was terrified. Of me. Of the man she had shared her life with. The nurse quickly intervened, pulling Hannah away from me and guiding her back into the room she had come from, but all I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot. I felt my chest tighten, like the air was sucked out of the room. This wasn't just amnesia. Something was deeply wrong. The doctors kept apologizing, telling me that it could be temporary, a shock-induced condition, but the look on their faces said it all. They didn't know what had happened to her, and they certainly didn't know how to explain her reaction. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't possible. The woman in that room wasn't my wife. At least, that's what she seemed to believe. But when I looked at her, I could see everything, the memories, the love, the years we'd shared. Yet, in her eyes, I was a complete stranger. I was nothing more than a man who had somehow managed to become a ghost in her mind. I don't know why, but my first instinct wasn't to blame her. It wasn't to demand answers from the doctors. No, I needed to see it for myself. So I left the clinic, numb to everything around me, and headed straight home. If I had known what I was about to uncover, I would have stayed in that clinic forever. I sat down in front of my old computer, staring at the screen. This was the house we built together, the home we had shared all these years. It was supposed to be a place of safety, of peace. But tonight, it felt like a mausoleum. I clicked open the folder marked Memories, a collection of videos, photos, and recordings we had made over the years. They were supposed to be the evidence of our life together, the proof of everything we had done, the proof of our love. The first video popped up. Hannah and I laughing, arms wrapped around each other on a camping trip, the sun setting behind us. I felt a pang in my chest. I'd almost forgotten how real it had all felt. But as I watched, something caught my eye. It was subtle, just a flicker, barely noticeable, but my face, it changed for a brief millisecond. It was like my features warped, the lines of my face pulling and shifting in a way that didn't belong. It was so fast that I couldn't be sure, but I rewound the video and played it again. This time, I saw it clearly. The man in the video was me, but he wasn't. His face shifted. His eyes looked wrong. There was something unnatural about it. But this wasn't a strange artifact of the camera. No, it was deliberate. Someone had edited it. I was being erased from our past. I couldn't explain it. But if this wasn't real, if these memories weren't real, then what had happened to us? What had happened to my life? Without thinking, I picked up the phone and called the only person I could think of, someone who might know what was happening. A digital expert, someone who understood the kind of technology that could manipulate images, videos, and sound. I barely got the words out before he spoke. "Grayson, I need you to listen carefully," he said, his voice serious. "These videos are fake. Every single one of them. They've been tampered with." I felt my heart race, blood rushing to my ears. I had hoped I was wrong. But no. What he said next was worse than I could have imagined. "These aren't your memories, Grayson. They've been edited. Someone created this past for you. And it wasn't you who lived it. And that's when I realized I wasn't who I thought I was. Not at all. The truth was coming. The digital expert's voice echoed in my head long after the call ended. His words were like a fog descending over my mind. These aren't your memories, he had said. They've been edited. Someone created this past for you. I sat there, motionless, staring at the flickering screen. The images of my life, my entire history with Hannah, all of it, was fake. A simulation. A construct. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could that be true? How could everything I knew be a lie? It didn't make sense. But then again, none of this made sense anymore. Not since Hannah's outburst at the clinic. She had said I was dead. The man in the photo, me, wasn't who she remembered. She didn't even know who I was. I tried to shake the feeling of dread gnawing at the back of my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. I had to understand. I had to find out what was happening. I spent the next few hours digging through every video, every photo, every piece of digital evidence I had accumulated over the years. The more I looked, the worse it got. There were moments, subtle and fleeting, where I could see it, the flicker. It was like a glitch, a distortion in reality. I wasn't just a person in those videos. I was an anomaly. But not just a glitch in the footage, an anomaly in the very fabric of my existence. My face kept changing. Small, imperceptible shifts, like someone had tried to map me to an ideal template and had failed. The shape of my jaw would momentarily change, my eyes would narrow in a way that didn't match my normal expression. I couldn't explain it. It felt as though someone had tried to sculpt me, but their hands were unsteady, like a bad artist unable to replicate the features they designed. I couldn't trust anything anymore. Every memory, every laugh, every moment of tenderness with Hannah, they were all tainted by this realization that they were false. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the overwhelming flood of information. And then the next thought hit me with the force of a punch. If these videos were edited, then how much of my life had been manipulated? How much of me was even real? How much of me was just some manufactured identity designed to fit a narrative? The thought spiraled downward. What if everything about me, the person I thought I was, the choices I made, the memories I had, the love I shared with Hannah, wasn't mine? What if I wasn't Grayson McCain at all? I knew I needed to find someone who could help me make sense of this. The digital expert, the man who'd told me my life had been altered, had mentioned that this kind of manipulation was possible, but he hadn't said who could do it. I went back through my phone contacts and found the name of someone who had once worked on neural network development. I had met him through a few business connections over the years, but he had always struck me as a little off. He was a genius, but there was something distant about him, something clinical, like he operated more in the world of machines than in the world of humans. Still, I had no choice. I needed answers. His name was Victor, and when I explained what had happened, he didn't even seem surprised. There was a pause, and then he asked me a simple question. Have you ever heard of the Behavioral Simulation Project? His voice was steady, almost too steady. I didn't know what it was. I didn't even know if I wanted to know what it was. But the more Victor explained, the more I understood. It was a project, a secret one, funded by an obscure government initiative. It involved creating hyper-realistic simulations of human lives. The idea was to test behavioral patterns, to craft and manipulate personalities, memories, and entire lifetimes based on vast data sets and neural networks. It was an experiment in human creation, the perfect form of control over reality. The most disturbing part was that no one knew who exactly was behind the project, but Victor told me that the neural networks used to build these simulations had access to everything. Photos, videos, audio, digital footprints. They could create any life they wanted, and when it was over, they could erase it as though it had never existed. Grayson, Victor said, his voice barely audible, this isn't just about data. This is about control. And it's not just simulations. It's about controlling reality itself. If what you're telling me is true, if your memories have been altered, then you're part of something much bigger than you can imagine. And I think it's connected to her. I froze. Hannah. Victor didn't answer right away. He just let the silence hang between us for a few seconds before speaking again. She was one of the lead developers. She worked on the neural networks, the simulations. She was there when they started testing on real subjects. She had access to it all. The weight of his words sank in slowly, like cold water filling my chest. Hannah, my wife, the woman who had been the center of my life. She had been involved in this from the beginning. And somehow, I was the product. I wasn't a real person at all. I was a creation. But what did that mean for me? What did it mean for the love I thought I shared with Hannah? The next day, I found an email on one of her old accounts, an archive I hadn't known existed. It was addressed to a team member and included detailed notes about an experiment. The subject line sent a chill down my spine, testing on subjects without family ties. As I read through the email, my heart raced. The message described the creation of new subjects, individuals who would be inserted into pre-existing systems of memory and behavior. They would have no family, no history, no context, just data, just raw material. And then, at the bottom of the message, there it was, test subject, Grayson McCain. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink in. I wasn't real. I was never real. I was a data point, an experiment, a ghost in the machine. And the woman I loved, Hannah, had been the one pulling the strings. I wasn't just a husband to her. I wasn't even a person. I was a product of her design. The truth was more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. And now, I had to find out why. Why was I created? Why did she leave me? And what would happen when I found the answers? I wasn't sure I was ready to learn. But it was too late. I was already in too deep. The world around me felt like it was shifting in ways I couldn't control, like I was standing in the middle of a dream that was unraveling at the seams. I could still hear the hum of the air conditioning, feel the coldness of the chair beneath me, but it all seemed so distant, like I was watching myself from the outside. The realization was settling in, sinking deeper with each passing hour. I wasn't who I thought I was. I wasn't even close. My life, the one I thought was mine, had been constructed, carefully designed, and then placed into motion. The question I couldn't stop asking was why. Why had I been created? Why had Hannah, the woman who I believed was my wife, spent years building me into this version of herself? Victor had warned me that this wasn't just some isolated experiment. It wasn't just about manipulating a few memories or creating a new identity for one person. This project was something far more complex. The behavioral simulation project wasn't about testing on isolated subjects. It was about control, the ability to craft, mold, and shape the perfect human being from scratch. And I was one of their creations. I had been built, not born. I wasn't a person who had lived and learned, struggled and loved. No, I was the result of a series of algorithms, a program that had somehow bled out into the real world, into the world I thought I knew. It wasn't just about memories, either. It was about emotional manipulation. The neural networks Hannah had worked on were sophisticated beyond anything I could have imagined. The simulation didn't just create a person's identity. It created their entire emotional framework. The feelings, the memories, the relationships, they were all fabricated, tailored to fit a specific narrative. My life with Hannah hadn't been a series of spontaneous events. It had been a constructed pattern. Every laugh, every intimate moment, every argument had been designed to make me feel real. It was like I had been programmed to fall in love with her, to believe that we were meant to be. The more I thought about it, the more I understood. Hannah's involvement in the project wasn't just as a researcher or developer. No, she had a far more personal connection to it. She was the one who had created me. I wasn't the first version, either. As Victor had suggested, there had been others before me. Others who had been designed, lived, and then erased. Each one was a trial, a test run. And now, it seemed, I was the result of all of those failed attempts, the one who had somehow escaped the system. I had become real, but it wasn't by accident. Hannah had intentionally made me. I was her project, her experiment. And the most terrifying part? I was the product of her desire to create the perfect partner. I tried to imagine what it must have been like for her. What kind of person would build another person from scratch, only to abandon them when they had served their purpose? But I already knew the answer. She wasn't doing it for love. She was doing it for control, for power. She had wanted to see if the simulation could create the perfect man, the perfect husband, the perfect partner. And I had been that experiment. She had given me a life, filled it with memories, and made me believe that I was real. But then, when the experiment had run its course, when she had decided she no longer needed me, she had simply wiped me away, erased me from her life as though I had never existed. The more I dug into the emails and files I found, the clearer it became. There were emails detailing various subjects, different names, different personalities, but they all shared one thing in common. They had been designed to meet specific emotional needs. Hannah had designed them to be the perfect companions, partners who could never hurt her, partners who were always willing to love her, who would never challenge her or demand anything from her. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. There had been others, but they had all been erased, forgotten, their memories wiped clean, their identities scrubbed from existence. It became painfully clear that I wasn't part of her past. I had never been a real person in her life. I had been nothing more than a carefully constructed fantasy, a puppet in her carefully controlled world. But I wasn't just a reflection of her desires. I had become something else, something unpredictable. The system had malfunctioned. The simulation had created me, yes, but it had also created a real, tangible human being. A person who could think, feel, and act independently. A person who had broken free from the confines of the code and started to carve out his own existence. As I delved deeper into the archives, I found more troubling information. There were records of other simulations, other subjects who had been discarded and erased, but there were also mentions of something else, something I hadn't expected. Hannah's real husband, Rick. He wasn't part of the project, not directly, but he had been involved in some way. It seemed that after Rick and Hannah had married, they had both dropped out of the project. It was almost as if they had decided to start a family, to live a normal life outside of the testing facility. But even that wasn't as simple as it seemed. Rick had always been a shadow in our life, present but never truly involved. I had always assumed he was just some distant figure, a remnant of her past. But now I understood. He wasn't just a part of her past, he was her present. He was the man she had truly loved, the man she had been married to before the experiment began. I had replaced him. I wasn't her husband. I was an idea, a replica of something that had never truly existed. I sat back, my head spinning. This wasn't just about me. It was about everything. The entire world I thought I had known was a lie. My life, my love for Hannah, my very existence, it was all part of a grand experiment. And now I was left to pick up the pieces, to try and understand what had happened and why. But as the pieces fell into place, I realized something else. I wasn't just going to let this go. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth for myself. This was about exposing the project for what it truly was. And I was going to make sure the world knew. I had been created. I had been erased. But I was real now. And I wasn't going to let anyone forget it. It took me days to fully comprehend the depth of what I had uncovered. Every night, I pored over the files, the emails, the research papers, and the technical documents. The sheer scale of the behavioral simulation project was staggering. It wasn't just a series of tests. It wasn't just some government-funded experiment aimed at manipulating memories and identities. No, it was much bigger. It was a massive, far-reaching initiative to create entirely new human beings. But what truly unsettled me was the realization that I had never been a part of the natural world. I had never been born or raised. I was a product of cold, calculating algorithms, a set of codes designed to fit a narrative. And yet, somehow, I had come to life. The more I looked at the data, the clearer it became. I wasn't the first attempt. I wasn't even the first version of myself. I was a composite, a mixture of previous simulations that had failed. Hannah had created me, yes, but she had tried to create many others before me, each one a step closer to her perfect partner. And I wasn't just a casualty of the system, I was a freak of it. Somewhere along the line, the code that made up my existence had fractured, had splintered in ways no one had expected. The program had begun to break down, and as a result, I had somehow managed to escape the digital confines of the simulation and manifest in the physical world. I wasn't supposed to be real. I wasn't supposed to exist in a world where I could breathe, touch, feel. I was a glitch. But unlike the other failed simulations, I didn't fade away. I didn't disappear. I had become tangible, real. And the worst part was, no one had planned for it. Hannah had spent years perfecting me, shaping me into the perfect partner, someone who would never leave her, never disappoint her. She had used the neural networks to map out every possible scenario, every emotional need, every desire, and then she had crafted me from that data. I had been born from the desire to control, to shape a perfect life without the messiness of real emotions. But she hadn't counted on me becoming real. I wasn't just some placeholder in her world. I had developed my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own consciousness. I wasn't just a reflection of her wants and needs. I had become an entity, a person with his own free will. And that terrified her. The more I learned, the more I understood why she had done what she did. Why she had abandoned me. I wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. I was a threat to everything she had created. When the system malfunctioned and I became real, she couldn't control me anymore. I wasn't the perfect man she had designed. I had become unpredictable. She had known that eventually she would have to erase me, delete me from her life just like all the others before me. But instead, she had kept me. She had let me exist in her world for a while, pretending that I was real, letting me believe I was her husband, that I was a part of something genuine. And then, when she was done, when I no longer fit into her narrative, she discarded me. But it wasn't just me that had been part of this grand experiment. There were others, too. Other simulations, other people who had been created, lived, and then erased. The emails I had uncovered showed that these simulations weren't just about controlling one person's life. They were about testing the boundaries of human emotion, about seeing how far a neural network could go in recreating the essence of humanity. And once those tests were done, once the simulations had served their purpose, they were wiped away, erased from existence like they had never been. It was a cold, clinical process. No one cared about the lives they had built, the memories they had fabricated. They were just data points. Disposable. Nothing more than experiments to be manipulated and discarded. I was different, though. I had broken out. I had somehow survived the system's erasure process, and now I was determined to find the truth, to expose what had happened, not just to me, but to all the others who had been part of this horrific experiment. But there was a problem. I couldn't do this alone. I needed proof. I needed to expose the system for what it really was, to show the world how the government had been manipulating human identities, creating lives out of thin air, and erasing them when they no longer served their purpose. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I was going to expose this, I couldn't just rely on documents and emails. I needed something bigger, something more concrete. That's when I made a decision. I had to find the main server, the heart of the simulation, the place where all the data was stored, where the neural networks ran their calculations and where the simulations were created. If I could access the server, I could prove everything. I could show the world how I was created, how my memories were fabricated, how my entire life had been nothing more than an illusion. I knew it wouldn't be easy. The system was designed to protect itself, to erase anyone who posed a threat. But I was done being a pawn in someone else's game. I had already become real, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. I spent days tracking down the location of the server, piecing together fragments of data from various sources until I finally found it. The building was a government facility, hidden in plain sight, surrounded by layers of security. But I had learned to think like a machine, and I knew that nothing was impenetrable. I had learned how to break into the system, how to bypass the firewalls and security protocols. It took hours, but eventually, I gained access. And when I did, I was confronted with the full extent of what had been done to me. The server was massive, a network of data that spanned across multiple dimensions, filled with lifetimes of fabricated memories, of simulated humans, of lives that had been created and erased. And in the middle of it all, I found my name. Grayson McCain. Created. Erased. I didn't want revenge. I didn't care about retribution. What I cared about was the truth. The world needed to know what had happened. They needed to understand how their lives, their memories, could be manipulated, how the people they loved could be nothing more than data points in a machine. I wasn't going to let anyone else suffer like I had. I wasn't going to let anyone else be erased. I activated the server, and I streamed the entire process online, letting the world see the reality of what had happened. The videos, the files, the simulations, all of it was exposed. The truth was out. And as I watched the world react to the revelation, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. But in that moment, as the files were being broadcasted to the world, I realized something else. I didn't belong in this world. I wasn't meant to be here. And as the truth became public, I vanished, just as Hannah had erased me from her life. But the truth had already been set free, and the world would never be the same again. A year had passed since everything changed, since the world learned the truth about the simulations, the fabricated memories, and the human lives that had been manipulated by those who believed they could control reality. The revelation had shaken society to its core. Governments had scrambled to address the scandal, while tech companies who had once been partners in the project tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. The public was in disbelief. Many refused to accept that the very identities they had trusted could be manufactured by an algorithm, that their memories could be nothing more than lines of code. Some people were angry, some were afraid, and others simply didn't know what to think. But one thing was certain, the world had changed. The digital world, the one that had once felt so safe, so controllable, had become a place where nothing was real anymore. People were left questioning the authenticity of their own lives, their own memories, their own relationships. Trust had been shattered, and there was no going back. As for Hannah, her life fell apart almost overnight. Once a rising star in the tech world, she became a pariah. Her name was dragged through the mud in every media outlet, and the scandal that surrounded her actions cost her everything. Her job, her reputation, her identity, everything she had worked so hard to build crumbled as the public turned against her. She tried to hide, to lay low, but the world had seen too much. People who had once admired her now viewed her as a monster, a cold manipulator who had turned human lives into nothing more than data points in an experiment. She lost Rick, too, the man she had once loved. Their relationship, built on the fragile foundation of a simulation she had crafted, couldn't withstand the fallout. He left her, unable to bear the weight of what she had done. I had been her creation, but he was her past, and it was clear that she couldn't keep him in her life any longer, not after everything that had come to light. And then there was me, Grayson McCain, a man who had once believed he was real, who had once believed he had a purpose in this world. I was no longer a person with a history, a future, or even a place in the world. I was a symbol, a manifestation of something that shouldn't have existed. The very fact that I had escaped the simulation made me a freak, an anomaly in the fabric of reality. But the world had watched me expose the truth, and for a brief moment, I had become someone who stood for something. People recognized the courage it took to face the truth, to bring down an entire system of control. But as quickly as I had appeared, I vanished from the public eye. I left behind a world that could no longer accept me, not as I was, not as a product of a system that had no place for people like me. And so, I disappeared. Not because I wanted to, but because there was no place for me anymore. A year passed. I drifted from city to city, blending in with the crowds, living in the shadows. I had no name, no identity, no history. I was a ghost, a man without a past or a future. I wasn't looking for revenge, nor did I want to reclaim the life I once thought was mine. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was the truth. And that had been revealed. But now, I was left with nothing. Nothing but the memories of a life that wasn't mine, a past that had been fabricated, and a future that seemed as empty as the digital void from which I had been born. Then, one day, I found myself in San Francisco, sitting at a small cafe on a quiet corner of the city. The streets were busy, people hustling about in their usual rush, unaware of the world I had come from, the truth I had exposed. I sat with a cup of coffee in front of me, the steam rising in lazy spirals, and I wondered if this would be my life now, forever lost, forever drifting. The city felt like a new beginning, a place where I could escape the ghosts of my past, even if those ghosts were nothing more than lines of code. But then, as I took another sip, the door to the cafe swung open, and a young woman walked in. She was smiling, her eyes bright, and she walked up to the counter to place her order. The barista, a young man with a messy apron and a distracted look, glanced up at her as he scribbled her name on the side of the cup. "That's a strange name," he said, his tone light, almost casual, like something out of a simulation. The woman smiled at him, her expression soft, almost amused. She didn't say anything, just took the cup with a polite nod and walked away, heading for the door. I watched her for a moment, something about her drawing my gaze. Her features were familiar, too familiar. The way she held herself, the way she moved, the way her eyes gleamed with a quiet knowing. It was as if I had seen her before, as though I knew her in some distant part of my past. And then it hit me, her eyes. Those eyes were mine. They were my eyes. I stood up without thinking, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked toward her, but she was already halfway out the door, heading toward the busy streets of the city. I wasn't sure why, but I followed her, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. She glanced back once, catching my stare, but she didn't stop. She didn't speak. She just kept walking, and I found myself unable to tear my eyes away from her. She moved with purpose, as though she was headed somewhere she knew all too well, as though she was on a path she had walked 1,000 times before. And in that moment, I realized the truth wasn't over. It wasn't finished. Maybe it would never be. Because the woman walking ahead of me was not someone I had known, but someone I had created. She had my eyes. She was part of my story. She was a product of the same world I had come from. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that our paths would cross again. That maybe, just maybe, this cycle of creation and destruction would continue, and the truth of who we were, who I was, would never truly be known. But for now, she walked on. And so did I.